Yeah, so essentially the coordinator, regardless of what you learn in a course or any textbook, the study coordinator is the project manager of the research clinic. So they are the ones responsible for keeping the PIs on track and making sure that they are signing in a timely manner as per ALCOA-C, attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, complete. So all of those acronyms, plus the bunch of other ones that come after it that they keep adding, is the role of the coordinator to make sure the PI is compliant with. And I tell my staff repeatedly, your job is to make the PI's life easy. Yes, it is their responsibility to do these trials, to have oversight, but that is your role. This is literally why you are hired and employed, is to keep the study, including the timelines, including the PI oversight, including the GCP compliance for the PI, on track. And a good coordinator will do that, and a not so good one will kind of let the PI figure things out, which is generally a bad idea. They can barely figure out their own patient care at times, let alone these ancillary things they have going on, like running clinical research studies, because for the vast majority of doctors out there, running studies is just ancillary to what they do as a physician. That is probably true for 90+% of the physicians that I've ever come across. We use tools, a lot of tools, voluntarily. So I think we're in an era where sites have kind of moved on from hand-me-down tools, meaning this is what the sponsor or the CRO want us to use, versus we're willingly choosing to implement these tools and these automations in order to make our workflow more efficient. And so some of the tools we use, there's things like Monday.com. It's a project management tool. We put out standing action items. There's certain workflows you can automate, like you can get PI's emails forwarded to Monday to where the proper coordinator will see it and be able to get on it and respond, or tell the PI, hey, you have a really urgent email in your inbox. Even though the PIs all have access to their emails, we know how that is. You don't even have to be a busy physician to know what it's like to miss an email. And once again, it's the coordinator's role. So there's all these tools that we're using, Monday, Creo, things like, there's other vendors that actually even give free tools to sites. Viva. We're in the golden era of research sites, and a lot of it has to do with these site-centric tools. And we are actually only at the beginning of what I think will be tremendous automations, especially when you consider AI is making its ways into our sites and into our industry as a whole. So I do think that these tools help sites and coordinators maintain some degree of control as well as sanity over their own workflow, because it does get overwhelming. So good clinical practice ranges, it's pretty diverse in what it covers. Ultimately, at the top of that pyramid or hierarchy would be patient safety, and everything underneath that sort of leads up to ensure the proper foundation for patient safety is achieved. You get into things like data quality, the timeliness of entering data, the timeliness of resolving a query. In my opinion, and I believe all site owners should have the same modus of operandi, is patient safety is number one. That's the one non-negotiable. Everything else, we're humans, we have shortcomings, we have inefficiencies. Those take a backseat. Patient safety should not. Now, there are times when you do have a GCP issue that directly impacts patient safety, such as randomizing a patient that probably should not have been randomized for whatever reason, whether it's lack of efficacy from prior treatment history or lack of appropriate concomitant medications that the patient is on that could potentially pose a risk. Those ones we try to prevent proactively by having quality assurance people look at patients before they're randomized. The monitors themselves look at these patients. I think AI is going to do a better job of helping look at things like inclusion-exclusion criteria, but there are other things that are out of our control. So what do you do when a patient's already in a study but then just goes missing and takes the investigation of product with him? That is technically a deviation. That is outside of your control. There are policies you're supposed to follow. As long as you're covering those policies, you've got to be compliant with good clinical practice, you've got to be compliant with the protocol, and then you've got to be compliant with your own site standard operating procedures in that order. But I think if we use patient safety as the North Star of what we do and how we operate, I think everything else is forgivable. Private sites especially are profit driven. So we make more money the longer our patients stay in the trial, right? And you can argue there's a good and bad side to that incentive structure. But one of the good aspects of that is patient centricity and patient retention becomes top of mind as a business outcome for the sites. So burdening them with extra diaries or making sure that you're logging into your patient reported outcome tool, 5-6 times a day, I think it's excessive. I think the patients get paid for their visits when they come into the visit. Sometimes there's remote visits or virtual visits that they can do from home that are compensated. But over the last few years, the temptation has been from the side of the sponsors, quite honestly, and the CROs, to bombard the patients with unnecessary collections of data. And just because you can doesn't mean it's a good idea to collect something. It has to be relevant to the study and the primary, or at least the secondary endpoints of the trial. And what we have seen over the past few years as the proliferation of this technology came out was the temptation for these sponsors and CROs to collect data just because they can. And I think that's what the GCP revision was, a direct response to this and to patient advocates speaking up for themselves. And quite honestly, sites are patient advocates. We're the ones dealing with the patients, not the sponsors, not the CROs. So if the patients are not able to advocate for themselves, because there may be no direct line of communication between the patients and the sponsors vis-a-vis an advocacy group, the sites, the research sites, are the ones that should take that role by default. And this is how sites have been operating, not giving unnecessary burden to patients and not making them jump through hoops. We do everything we can to pay for transportation if we need to, pay for meals if they're long visits, provide daycare. There's a lot that we go out of our way to make sure that the patients have a good experience when they're in the study. A consensus, at least amongst physicians that I know, keeping patients safe, very similar to the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm. What stems from that below is everything else that goes into providing reliable data, which is where you kind of get out of patient safety aspect, but there is some crossover because ultimately we're all patients, and this data is supposed to be reflective of that patient population within the world that exists, which is why sponsors and the FDA want more diversity in their trials to begin with. They want it to be more reflective of the real world patient population. So when it comes to having a North Star of how to operate as a site, GCP is the beginning, but within that framework, there has to fit the actual protocol, a working protocol for the sponsor, and then there has to fit within that framework, so it's yet increasingly layers of less flexibility, the site standard operating procedures. And from there, that dictates how the site themselves will operate. Whenever there's a conflict, you adhere to GCP. And ultimately, I think that's what its role is for.